Now I'm ready to load content from this JSON API. But first, let me show you where to make API calls in Nuxt. When a request comes in, the first hook that's fired is the Nuxt server init method. It's called on the server side, which means it's a great time to grab content before the page is rendered. I'm going to use this hook to load my navigation here pretty soon. The next hook is Middleware, which can be used to set conditions or even redirect a page. Next is Validate, which validates route parameters as either true or false. Finally, the most common hooks you will use are async data and fetch. These also run on the server and they return data before the page is rendered. And if I change routes, they are run again, which makes them useful for pages and components since those typically need to update between pages. So that's the Nuxt Lifecycle. I'll need an HTTP client to make API calls, so I'm going to use Axios. And more specifically, I'm going to use Nuxt's own Axios module. Once that's installed, head over to nuxt.config and add it as another module to the modules array, just like this. Now I'm ready to set up my navigation. Within my store directory, I'm going to create a file called index.js. If you're new to the Vuex store, I'll explain this simply. A store is basically a centralized data storage for your whole Nuxt site. And it always begins by exporting state. In my state, I will store the menu array. The next piece to any store is mutations. And these are the only functions that can manipulate something in your state. I'm writing one to set my menu. It accepts a menu array and assigns that to state.menu. The next piece to any store are actions, and these are functions that typically communicate with outside APIs, making it a great spot for the Nuxt server init method we talked about earlier, which when called by Nuxt will return an Axios GET request to my menu endpoint. Because it's a promise, I can use then to handle the response, and what I'll do is say context.commit set menu and pass in the response, which will be my menu array. So commit is connected to context. What is that all about? Context holds different store helpers such as commit, which is why we pass it into this server-side function of ours. So the server has access to our commit function. And since context contains named exports, I can import them individually. So I could say commit, state, I can get getters. But right now I just need commit. So I'll import that and now I can remove context. So as a recap, we commit the response from our menu API endpoint. We then mutate state using setMenu, which will store those menu items here in our menu state. Now let's use this in our global navigation component. And before we do, I need to take my menu items and use a v-for loop so that we can generate our links from that menu array. So I'll use v-for to iterate over each item in the menu. I'll then set the to attribute to / the item slug, and then the label to item title. Come down to script and let's import map state from Vuex. And what this is an extremely handy helper that allows us to use computed and then map state to basically map something from our store, which we will use to map menu. And now when my Nuxt site loads, the very first thing I get is my menu from this menu JSON API. Now that we've got our menu, let's set up our pages. I'm going to go to index.view under pages and get rid of all this data because we don't need it hard-coded anymore. Instead, I'm going to use that async data method that we talked about earlier. This takes in params and Axios. What are we doing with params and Axios? Well, the first thing we do is use Axios to get our pages endpoint along with params, which we passed in here, and getting the slug off of the params, which then returns a response of pages in which we want the first page. I expect these params to be something like about or services, but what about the home page, which would be empty? To handle that, I'll write a simple if statement which checks the slug. If it's undefined, reassigns it to homepage. All right, so that's working, but what about my subpages, products and services? There's not a route matching these. Rename index.view to _slug. What this does is match that page template to any slug. It's like a wildcard route. Great, so this is working. Let's move on to the blog where I'll go into index.view. I'm going to delete all of that placeholder data and again use async data, but this time I'm hitting my posts endpoint and setting posts to the response, which I then iterate through here. Check that out in the browser and it's working. So now let's set up the individual article. I'll go to slug within my blog directory. Once again, delete our static data and use async, this time hitting our posts endpoint, using the slug parameter, and setting the post. Check this out in the browser, and we've got an article being loaded from our JSON API. In the next video, I'll abstract my API calls into API repositories to make this project immensely more maintainable.